27 years ago in March, this was the center of world attention. A happening at this oil well known as the Mary Sudik captured the attention of the entire world. This was a gusher, and it was one of the biggest ones that was ever known in this park. 2,000 barrels of oil per hour were pouring out over the top of this derrick, which is itself 127 feet tall, and it gushed to a height of 400 feet. If it had been just 1 or 2 days, it wouldn't have been nearly as exciting, but it went on for 11 days before they could finally cap it. When she finally blew in, the Wild Mary, as they called her, after several days, blew all of her tools and equipment that were down in the pipe up into the crown block and up into the derrick, and the equipment was so tangled up that they couldn't get it out so that they could put a cap on the well. Newsmen from all over the United States were flown in to this, the first major well, the most publicized oil well in the country, as they called it at that time. As to its importance to the Oklahoma City oil pool, a lot of people seem to think of the Mary Sudik as the first well, the well that led to the actual discovery of the Oklahoma City pool. But we've been looking around checking to see whether or not this is fact or fiction, and this, among other facts, you'll find out on our series on the discovery and development of the Oklahoma City oil pool. "27 years ago, on March 28th, the headline in the Oklahoma City Times, which we're looking at now, read 2,000 hourly for a wild gusher. They were talking about the Mary Sudik well, otherwise known as Wild Mary. Claude, I guess you have a very large stock of vivid memories about the Wild Mary. What did you see when you were down there the first time?
Well, to us who had seen some 30 or 40 wild wells and more than 150 wells that had blown over the top, it was just another well blowing out and going wild.
Well, it certainly got a lot of publicity. A lot of people think that the Mary Sudik was the biggest and the first in this area.
Yes, that's true. It's frequently confused with the #1 Oklahoma City, which opened the Oklahoma City field some 2 years prior.
How did it get its big reputation, Claude?
Well, the Mary Sudik came at a time when there was a dull news period. There just wasn't much happening. And of course, we played news wild, you might say, in the Times, something sensational, and there it was. There was a possibility of men being hurt, men being killed. It had all the fascinations of the other wells that we had had. But being in a dull news period, we naturally attempted to probably overplayed the story.
Well, I guess as each day went on, then the interest picked up until the 11-day period was over and it was finally capped.
Yes, and aiding that was the fact that Floyd Gibbons, at that time, one of the outstanding newscasters of all times, was broadcasting twice a day from Chicago. He heard about it, and he asked us on the Times to give him a story each morning and each afternoon for his broadcast. Well, of course, it was a dead story after a few days, but we had to build it up for him, and what he added to it, a few other things, finally it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
A lot of us have heard a great deal about an oil well around Oklahoma City called the Mary Sudik, and a lot of us seem to think that that was the first and maybe the biggest well. Is that true, Mr. Hodges?
No, the first well was Oklahoma City #1.
You worked on that one then,
yes.
I take it. What do you recall about the #1?
Well, that well was brought in December 4th, 1928. We drilled that well all the way down with rotary tubes.
How deep was it?
About 6,800.
How many days had you been working on it?
We was on that well about 140 days.
What do you recall of the day it finally came in?
Well, that day it was kind of a dark, hazy, cloudy day, raining a little bit. We was repairing our rig down there, and we had a big fire built up. It was all standing around there, and I happened to look up there, and there was oil going every place. So we put the fire out right quick, and wasn't but a few minutes, about half Oklahoma City was out there. And that's a day that we'll never forget.
That was a pretty big gusher. Was that one of the most exciting moments in your life?
It was in the oil field, yes.
So that a pretty good well, a big well?
I suppose that well produced more oil than any well in Oklahoma City field, as far as I know.
And that would be then the beginning of the Oklahoma City oil pool itself.
That was the beginning of Oklahoma City field.
I've seen oil running down the creeks almost bank full. I've seen gas wells on fire in almost all directions, where it would light up the countryside for miles around. What are some of the regulations that oil companies operate under, other than the number of barrels of oil that they can produce? Well, they're regulated as to the number of wells they can drill on a lease by spacing orders, so that the field may be developed in an orderly manner and that all interested parties will get a fair shake at the production. Is the driller allowed to take a certain amount out at first to get back his original investment? We have what is called a discovery allowable. If it's in a virgin territory and a virgin common source of supply, we allow them to produce for not to exceed 150 barrels a day to not to exceed 60 days. Now, they tell me that most of the pressure is gone from the Oklahoma City pool. Is this then the end of an era for this particular pool, or does it have a future? It possibly has a considerable amount of primary production under primary methods. But under secondary recovery operations, either by gas reinjection or by water flood, they could expect to recover probably more oil than has already been recovered from this field.
Of course, none of us see all the problems just alike. I'm sure that Governor Gary wouldn't agree with me on all of my thinking, but I would say in most part that Governor Gary's administration has been good for the people of Oklahoma.
In many respects, I think it has. I think particularly in the school question, that Governor Gary faced a serious problem that confronts the state vigorously and progressively, and forced that issue and to a large extent, at least for the time being, solved it.
Well, I doubt very much if being a judicial officer at this time, and I am, and not a declared candidate for public office, I ought to comment either in a commendatory or critical way about Governor Gary.
I do. I think Governor Gary, by reason of the fact that he had served 14 years in the Oklahoma State Senate, had a personal acquaintance with the current problems of government in Oklahoma, that he's gotten along with his legislature, both sessions, better than any man in the history of the state that served as governor. The only place he's had any trouble has been on some extracurricular affair that was not connected with the legislature or the governor's office directly.
If I should run and if I should be elected, I would use the full power of the governor's office to not increase our tax structure.
Well, I think anybody would oppose an increase in taxation if possible, but it's a matter of weighing the need against the liabilities or disadvantages of an increase in taxation. And you'd have to be a little more specific for me to answer that question.
Well, I suppose everybody is in favor of more benefits and fewer taxes. But, of course, that's an obvious impossibility.
I'd be for more economy in government first. And it would only be when you had reached the place where no more economy could be exercised or could be brought about that any increase in taxes would be justified. I would not run on a program of increasing taxes.